Seeing is believing, we like to say. I thought about that phrase earlier this week when I heard a man use it after he had looked at one of those charts that are appearing in social media and in the news about the spread of this pandemic throughout the globe. This is a guy who had been somewhat skeptical of the severe measures that we're taking, both in the church and in the wider community, to keep ourselves at distance, maybe not isolated from one another, but socially at a distance, judged to be one of the most effective things we can do. He saw a comparative chart of countries that had managed to do that seriously and rather well and effectively, and countries which had not been observing the same kind of strict logic about keeping us at a distance physically from one another. He saw that chart and he said to me, "Seeing is believing." He was convinced by the data. I thought about that when I heard it from him, and as I considered this gospel story we have heard today, this reading from John's gospel, the telling of the story of the healing of the man born blind, that we get on this fourth Sunday in Lent. All of the readings we're hearing this Lent were originally aimed at the formation of adult converts to the Christian faith. They're part of an ancient pattern for helping those preparing to be baptized at Easter to go deep into the reality of converting their lives to the way of Jesus. This story in particular about the healing of blindness is, I think, fundamentally about learning to see the world, learning to see ourselves the way God sees us. It was something that converts to Christianity, abandoning one whole way of life and adopting a whole new way of life, the way of Jesus, the way of the cross, the way of death and resurrection. Their task in baptism was to learn to see the world anew. Their eyes open to new realities, to seeing beyond the appearance of things and into the spiritual nature of things. I was reminded, too, of what we believe is the community that John's gospel was written to at a time when faithful Jews had witnessed the destruction of the temple and fled its setting in Jerusalem. This group that John's gospel was likely written to was in the north somewhere beyond what are now called the Golan Heights. Anyway, a time in the life of the early Jewish Christian community when there was a parting of the ways. Some of the tension and the arguments reflected in the stories between the Pharisees and Jesus may reflect controversies that were occurring within that community when the parting of the ways of faithful Jews and those who would become called Christians was happening. We don't know for sure. It's not impossible to imagine. So there is tension, there's controversy between the Pharisees who have seen this blind man and experienced a whole host of assumptions about him and the reasons for his blindness. They, in fact, the Pharisees themselves, are blinded by fear, by prejudice, by self-righteousness. Any number of things are depicted in the story as we have it this morning. Blindness is one of a host of things that could exclude you from participation in the temple and then later in rituals. And so the Pharisees may be afraid. We don't know exactly how it may have been at the beginning, but they don't see the dignity of this man. They don't see his need. Jesus, on the other hand, does. Jesus looks at him and sees not someone who is bearing perhaps penalty for some sin somewhere. Jesus sees a need, always. Jesus sees the need. Jesus sees the heart. This man is cured by Jesus. His blindness is taken away. But even more important than that, the gospel insists to us, is that he comes to see Jesus. He comes to believe in Jesus. And so we might say, believing is seeing. Believing is really seeing. I wonder in this present moment, in this time of crisis, how our hearts might be opened, how our eyes might be opened to see beyond the appearance of things, how our faith might be enlarged to trust Jesus. How might we be led to a deeper belief and deeper faith?